So Jordan and the panel participants.
You guys just want to have a seat. Yep, we're going to have you guys sit right here. Let me speak. If you just can try to get close to the microphone because it's going in and out of the microphone. I'm not sure why. And our apologies to the people on Zoom. We're working on the microphones. There might be some in and out. We hear you and we're working on it.
So we're just waiting. Yes, so we're just waiting for John Cruden to come back. So we'll give this a minute. But since John knows Jordan Diamond very well, I'll introduce Jordan. So I want to introduce Jordan Diamond, who will serve as a moderator of this plenary session, which is really looking in a deeper dive at what are the ways that we are influenced in the broad practice arena by both microscale and macro scale. And we will hear from on 4 different issues that I think fit very, very well following both Roger and Juliet's comments. So I'm very, very pleased to have ELI continue to support and be co-sponsor. I think I've lost count on how many we've done together, but we like continuing the tradition with you as the new head of state, if you will. Jordan is president of the Environmental Law Institute, and her more inclusive bio is on our website. But she describes the Law Institute as making law work for people, places, and the planet. And I think more and more the partnerships that ELI has set up, and of course I'm a member of ELI and been a long time member, are really important. And also your continuing global reach, I think, is important as well. So prior to ELI, Jordan was executive director of the UC Berkeley Center for Law, Energy, and the Environment. She's received many awards from the American Bar Association, ELI, and others, and was appointed in 2018 by former Governor Jerry Brown to serve on the California Ocean Protection Council. So we now have John Cruden back. Jordan is going to introduce the panel. After she introduces the panel, we'll go all the way up to lunch, and then I'll give you some specifics of lunch. Does that set us in the right direction? Okay.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to GW for partnering and hosting this. And thank you to Barbara, to Randy, and to all of you for being here today. As noted, I'm Jordan Diamond, president of the Environmental Law Institute. Okay, you're going to hear me very loudly. But hopefully everyone online, this will help. Wonderful. So this morning we've started out, Roger went back 200 years, but looking at what has kind of led up to the context of today, obviously with a specific lens on corporate social responsibility. We just heard from Juliet on the last 20 years and with her observations of the progression in federal policy on the environment and specifically climate stage. This panel right now, we're looking at the landscape of what's happening right now. And so looking at it from multiple angles, from litigation to regulation, legislation, and public-private partnerships. So I am incredibly honored to be joined, to be a part of this panel. I'm going to introduce 4 people, none of whom actually need an introduction, but it's fun to introduce them anyway. First off, we will go with John Cruden. John is a principal at Beveridge and Diamond. where he offers clients the benefits of his decades of experience in environmental energy and every aspect of this field. For more than 2 decades, John was with the Department of Justice and one of the lead environmental litigators in the country, covering most of the major environmental litigation of the day, finally culminating in his Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General position as the head of the Environment and Natural Resources Division. Prior to that, he was my boss as the president of the Environmental Law Institute, and I am incredibly honored to have learned under him for a number of years. John is, we would honestly be here all day if we went through the list of John's accolades, but let's just say that it starts with awards from multiple presidents all the way on down. So John, thank you for joining us today. Next, we will turn to Sally Fisk. Sally is the Vice President, Assistant General Counsel, and Chief Counsel of Environment and Sustainability Law at Pfizer, based in New York. In this role, she leads the team providing strategic legal counsel to Pfizer and protecting its employees, communities, and the environment, and promoting compliance with domestic and international environmental health, safety, sustainability, and human rights requirements, as well as emerging ESG obligations and norms. Sally also provides oversight of Pfizer's EHS and sustainability risk management frameworks and provides legal support for Pfizer's philanthropic product donations. Prior to her current role, she was Assistant General Counsel and Chief Compliance Counsel for Pfizer Global Supply and a member of the manufacturing and executive team. I will also note with gratitude that Sally is a member of ELI's board of directors. Next, we will hear from Dr. Nat Kihane. He is president of C2ES, or the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, which is widely recognized in this country and internationally as a leading independent voice for practical policy and action to address the world's energy and climate challenges. Nat is an economist with more than 20 years of energy and environmental policy experience in academia, government, and the nonprofit sector, most recently as Senior Vice President for Climate with the Environmental Defense Fund, where he led EDF's research and policy advocacy on climate change in the United States and globally. From 2011 to 2012, Nat served in the White House as Special Assistant to the President for Energy and Environment in both the National Economic Council and Domestic Policy Council, helping shape the administration's policy on energy and environmental issues. The decade prior to that, Nat was the Assistant and then Associate Professor of Economics at Yale. And finally, we will hear from Jeff Rose. Jeffrey Rose is the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy for Battelle's Contract Research Organization. In this role, he is responsible for the development and execution of outreach, advocacy, and strategy before Congress, federal agencies, and elected officials. He works closely with senior leaders within the business to develop and advance Battelle's budget, policy, and legislative priorities. Prior to this, prior to joining Battelle in 2018, Jeff served 2 terms running New Hampshire state agencies responsible for economic development, travel, tourism, parks and recreation, forestry and land management, and cultural resources as a cabinet level appointee. He also spent nearly a decade working for BAE Systems Electronic Solutions sector in a variety of government relations and public affairs roles. Jeff began his career working for members of Congress in both the House and the Senate, and he has been an active member of his community and served in leadership roles for numerous nonprofit organizations. So thank you to to 3 of you in person and Sally joining us remotely from New York. Thank you for joining us today. Just so all of you know the format for the session, we will go one by one. We will hear remarks from each of our speakers, then we'll engage in some dialogue, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to John.
Jordan, thank you so much. And I applaud the Board of Governors of the Environmental Law Institute for picking you. It was a great inspired choice, and it's an honor to be at this great course and with wonderful panelists that we're all going to be talking with you today. I've been given the charge of basically courts and litigation. Where does that fit into the resource world? I can remember seeing this great cartoon of these 2 vultures sitting on a tree, and one vulture says, "You know what I really want to do in life is litigate." There, which we have a natural, focus on that. And so I'm going to do 2 parts. I'm going to talk primarily, eventually, when I get to it, about the Supreme Court, which is on everybody's mind. But I don't want to start there. When I'm starting about trends right now that are extraordinarily important, and this one is not getting as much attention as I think it deserves, is that this administration has just now gotten more judges confirmed than any other president at this time in their term than John Kennedy. John Kennedy had the most, but Biden is now at 75 judges. 18 of those are Court of Appeal judges, so those are more significant. There's still vacancies for sure, but when you have to go through the process of getting confirmations in a Senate that's voted 50-50, that means that you have to hold every Democratic vote for sure to get that. As Jordan said, I served in the Obama administration, so you can figure my politics. It was Mark Twain that said, "I do not belong to an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." There's truth that here. So that's not easy, right? It's not easy to do that, and yet those numbers are really significant. If I contrast that at this time in their tenure, remember I said that Biden had 75, Trump had 51, and Obama even less than that, 42. There are still vacancies, and I'll be happy. I'm still playing that out. But in that 75, 3/4 of them were women. And of that same 75, 2/3 of them were non-white. So we're seeing a change that you might not feel, for a number of years, but nonetheless, a change that's happening right now on the face of the judiciary. All right, so now let's turn to a little non-controversial subject, the Supreme Court. For many years, I used to start out all my discussions of the Supreme Court by saying, look at these public opinion polls about who you value. Congress comes out like at 7%, slightly below used cars dealers. Their government was higher, and always at the top was our judiciary, and the very top of that was the Supreme Court. That's not true right now. Right now, those public opinion polls have come down, largely looking at the last term or so, this term of the Supreme Court, immigration, guns, First Amendment, but of course the focus was on the abortion decision, Dobbs decision, which of course caught the attention, and that has had a lot of backlash to this Supreme Court. A backlash that was resulted now in just like current events. Remember Brett Kavanaugh, who lives in this area, had somebody that was coming to his house, with guns. By the way, the guy doesn't do it and decides not to. And what does he do? He calls his sister, and his sister says, "Call 911." What kind of a sister is that? Anyway, there it didn't happen. But Supreme Court, until very recently, there was fence around it to protect it. They've taken that fence down up until maybe the next term. Next term starts in October. You can no longer listen to a Supreme Court argument except online. Starting in October, you'll be able to come back. By the way, Juliet could have come to the last term, but I could not have. Juliet, they let press in, but they did not let practitioners in. By the way, there's enormous amounts of how you actually come before 9 Supreme Court judges when you are online, and they are in different locations. And now you have the famous toilet flushing incident, where in the middle of the argument, somebody flushed their toilet. Later, they found out it was Justice Breyer. But in any case, it does add humor to these challenging events. And of course, we also have during this past year, something that's never occurred during my lifetime, the leaking of an opinion. Never seen that. That was Justice Alito's draft of the Dobbs opinion. So this is a very high visibility there. Chief Justice Roberts had appointed an investigatory process to see how that happened. Surprisingly, Justice Gorsuch says that that's in the making and that they're supposed to be public. We don't have it right now there. But again, another just act that was sort of unprecedented in the Supreme Court. And then just, I guess one more, of the 75 judges that came before, we obviously have several new ones. Justice Jackson, who has not yet sat because she was replacing Breyer, and Justice Barrett. My good friend Bob Percival, who is the professor at University of Maryland and who clerked for Justice White, said that White said to him, every single time we have a new justice on the Supreme Court, it's a new Supreme Court. And we need to think about that. We need to think about what's happened because we've had now, four unless, President Trump, unprecedented, had 3 appointments there. So far, Biden has had 1. But each one of those, don't think of them as a block, each one of those really created a new Supreme Court. And now, as we go into this next term, it is essentially, again, one more time, a new Supreme Court. I'm going to talk about 3 cases. 2 of them have been decided, and one of them is the on-deck circle, keeping up with the thesis of this particular conference, and that is the transition of environment, natural resources, energy law, and in my case, the impact of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court takes about 70 cases a year. That's roughly what they do. They used to take more in the past, but for the last 5 or 6 years, they take about 70. By the way, it's not a bad job. You have your summers off. You have a clerk that works for you. You have nice quarters. You get paid, and you can stay there as long as you want. So, a good retirement plan. So, not a bad job if you can get it there. They have not been reluctant to take environmental cases. And if you look back over the last 5 or 6 years, environmental cases, maybe 8 to 10% of the docket there. One of the statistics, this is like, I went to a baseball game last night, by the way. Baltimore beat Washington 6-2. But those of us following the Supreme Court love statistics. We love all these things in it, and I will only give you 2 as I launch into the 3 cases. The first one is paired voting. Which 2, this is audience participation, which 2 justices would you think vote the same the most often? You have 9 choices. Again, I'll say it. So which 2 justices are most likely to vote together on it? And I'll even help you more. They voted together as to the result of the case 100% of the time, 2 of them. So every single case, they voted the same. You have to get 1 right because you've got to say Chief Justice Roberts because number 1, he's Chief Justice. And number 2, he's been in this spotlight on this one. And when I tell you who's been in the majority the most, you'll see he's been in the majority the most for last 5, 6 years. The other one, Kavanaugh. So Kavanaugh and Roberts voted together 100% of the time. They were also, the 2 of them, in the majority the most last term. 95% of the cases, they were in majority. So when we used to follow Justice Day O'Connor, we used to say, she would ask the first, she was a swing vote in a 5-4 case, O'Connor was. And so she tended to ask the first question during oral argument, and she would often tip her hand as to how she was voting based on that question. And there was those of us saying, well, sometimes we could just go home because after you figured out how O'Connor was voting, you kind of knew what the result would be. It's getting to that point with Roberts and Kavanaugh. If you can figure out what those 2 are doing, you'll know a lot about how that case is going to end. All right, 3 cases. And I'm doing media, environmental law, we talk about media. So I'm going to do land, water, and air. The land case was a case about Superfund, but it was out of Guam. The air case is the one that, Juliet mentioned. It's the West Virginia case, which is the, Clean Power Plan, greenhouse gas case. And then one scheduled for the first few days of the term in October, which is the Sackett case, which is really waters of the United States. So those 3 cases and why they are important. Remember, they only take 70 cases. They have thousands of cases coming to them there. So, you know, sort of interesting why they take cases. And they have proven, and they have proven in 2 of the 3 cases that I'm going to tell you about, they are not shy about taking controversial cases, and they're not shy about taking a case that many of us thought they didn't have to or maybe shouldn't have done there, but I'll get to that. Guam is a more straightforward case. Guam has a gigantic landfill that's been there for 50 or 60 years, like a lot of landfills that leak there, and it leaks into the ocean there. So while I was Assistant Attorney General, we sued them and ultimately put them into a receivership, largely to eventually close that landfill because it was leaking. Not the end of the story. I leave. New administration comes in there. And Guam, now having read environmental law, probably hiring one of you all to explain to them Superfund law, realizes they could sue the Navy because Navy did most of the work. Navy did most of the junk that was in that landfill came from the Navy, so they sued them. Not surprisingly, that's what I told you, that you know we're in a vulture world. And the Department of Defense, represented by my old group, Department of Justice, defended by saying, no, the statute of limitations has passed because there was a Clean Water Act consent decree during my era, and that triggered the 3-year statute of limitations. District Court agreed. The Ninth Circuit, which had jurisdiction over Guam, disagreed and said the case goes forward. One other statistic that is relevant to you if you are ever in a cocktail hour and people are asking you, here's this case that just comes up there, Jordan Diamond versus EPA. You know, do you have any idea how that's going to come out? You've never heard of the case. You ask, did Jordan Diamond prevail? No, she lost. Supreme Court reverses 70% of the time. So if you don't know anything about the case, as I just told you, you will say, you know, probably Jordan's going to prevail in that case because she lost, and they tend to reverse that decision. The only exception to that is a Ninth Circuit, which is in San Francisco, where the reversal rate's more like 90%. I always thought there's a little box in the Supreme Court that says all the other courts of appeals, and there's another box for the Ninth Circuit. So this case comes out of the Ninth Circuit, the Supreme Court takes it. They take the case. Remember, the Ninth Circuit has reversed the district court, which was pro-Guam. So if you know nothing else, right? Nothing else. How do you say it's going to rule? For Guam, right? For Guam, because they reversed 70% of the time. 4 weeks after oral argument, which is really quick, unanimous decision that said, no, if you're going to trigger the statute of limitations under a Superfund case, the settlement that triggered that statute of limitations also has to be Superfund. That's relevant for a lot of us practicing in the area because there's a lot of settlements out there that are not Superfund, where you want to do something that kind of looks like Superfund there. And the question of whether or not statute of limitations applies here, it's very clear decision written by Justice Thomas, who tends to write the Superfund decisions. He's written the last 3 or 4. Okay, put that aside, but allowed me to tell you about the 70% rule. The one obviously that had all the attention and even does today is called West Virginia versus EPA, because West Virginia was the lead state suing the government to enjoin in the beginning the President Obama's Clean Power Plan. Remember, as Juliet was laying out for you the first term of Obama, second term, and said, you know, second term was really a lot about climate change. One of the things that happened during that tenure was the Clean Power Plan. Gina McCarthy, then the EPA administrator, looking at power plants, a very far-reaching statute that was looking at power plants because at that stage, not today, but that stage, that was the largest source of greenhouse gases. Today, by the way, it's a transportation world, but then it was power plants, and trying to substantially reduce that. One of those issues was called generation shifting, where you're going to shift from coal-fired to some other form, you know, natural gas. They're controversial. The Supreme Court stayed implementation of that case. President Trump came in, extended that. came in with his own, you know, regulation for all that, and that's went to the Supreme Court. So what goes into the Supreme Court is because the DC Circuit invalidated the Trump rule, which automatically, theoretically, put into effect the Obama era rule. So despite the fact that the Biden administration said, we're not going to put that one into effect, Supreme Court took it anyway. There's a huge controversy statutorily about what is the extent of EPA's authority. Those of us doing this stuff, and I was representing during my tenure, defended the Obama Clean Power Plan, but you called it whether or not you could litigate only inside the fence line or you could go outside the fence line. Inside the fence line means you put pollution abatement equipment on the power plant. Outside means you could do other things there. One of the other things would be looking at, again, the generation shifting, how they're getting their fuel, what they're doing with that, essentially a cap and trade program there. So before, again, the DC Circuit, they invalidate the Trump rule, that puts into effect the Obama rule. All right, goes to Supreme Court. You know nothing else of the case. You haven't read it. What did I just tell you? What's likely to be the decision of the, now this is DC Circuit, not Ninth Circuit, but what's likely to be the decision? Come on, 77% of the time they reverse. They reversed here, 5-4 decision, and upheld, which vacates essentially what the DC Circuit did. So why is that so important environmentally? One is it constrains EPA's authority, what they can do for power plants. By the way, that's not as significant as it sounds because the market forces, what you are hearing, you know, today from Roger about market forces from GE, and so market forces did it. So the real significant is what was called the major question doctrine. So writing for the majority, Chief Justice Roberts invalidates it because he said, this is such a big rule. It is so important economically, so important to the government that Congress is going to have to speak really clearly, and they didn't speak really clearly in this case, and therefore invalidates it. So all these statutory arguments that I've told you about, inside, outside the fence line, they did not reach them. So again, why is that? It's so important. Not surprisingly, Congress doesn't speak clearly a lot there. Ordinarily, the Chevron doctrine takes over where you give deference to the agency explaining what they think ambiguous legislation looks like. In this case, they did not do any of that. In this case, they say on high, in those kind of gigantic big cases there, we're going to be looking at and seeking very clear statutory authority. And if that does not exist, we're going to invalidate it. Again, why is that relevant environmentally? Because in October, we're going to do Clean Water Act jurisdiction in a case called Sackett versus EPA. And the real question is in an older decision called Rapanos in 2006, where the Supreme Court did not come up with a majority opinion. It was 4-1-4. So 4 written by Scalia, 1 by Justice Kennedy, 4 in an opinion written by Justice Stevens. So there was not a majority opinion. So there's always been some chaos. What part of that opinion controls? The part that Scalia wrote that had 4 votes, the part that Kennedy wrote that only had 1 vote, kind of looked like it covered everybody. And that's always been a fight. The Ninth Circuit says the Kennedy rule controls, and they have taken the case. So on one hand, you could say, well, John, it's a Ninth Circuit. Obviously, they're going to invalidate it. But it's more complicated than that, because if you're talking about all of the water jurisdiction in the United States, is that a major case? Is that such a significant case that the Supreme Court would look and say, you really can't do much in wetlands because the Congress has not spoken that clearly on that particular subject? All right, so what do I want to leave you with? And that is Supreme Court is taking environmental cases. This is a new Supreme Court. When Rapanos was decided, only 3 of the judges that were in that opinion are now on the Supreme Court. We don't know what some of them were going to do. But the only thing is that in this case, the water case is kind of the argument of the clerks, because Justice Barrett, clerk for Justice Scalia, who wrote the one opinion, Justice Kennedy wrote the concurring opinion, and the question is, does the Scalia opinion control or the Kennedy opinion control? Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, clerk for Kennedy. So we'll see how clerks play in that role there. When we have time on questions and answers, I can do some issues about what's happening in some of the more natural resource damage settlements that just happened, but I think I'll turn this over back to Jordan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. I will say for the administrative record, I have no cases pending before EPA, and the Environmental Law Institute does not litigate. All right, we will now skip up to the Northeast. Sally, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jordan. Just to check that everyone can hear me and that the sound is okay. Do I get a thumbs up? Okay, super. Thank you. This is my first hybrid speaking event, so I can tell you I definitely miss being in the room, and I look forward to seeing you all in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. So a big thank you to ELI and to the Natural Resources Symposium for inviting me to participate. This is a great discussion thus far, and I imagine your next day and a half are really going to be very intriguing and full of good discussions. You know, our panel is focused on these ongoing influencers on environmental and natural resource law and policy. And one of those influencers that I'm going to talk about is this incredible increase in attention on corporate sustainability and ESG over the past few years. And just kind of a quick footnote on ESG, because it's a term that Roger mentioned, it's a term I'll mention, and probably other speakers will too. It's really a term that grew out of the investment field. The objective of ESG is to help investors, invest their money with a systematic and explicit inclusion of environmental, social, governance, risks, and opportunities with the intention of enhancing long-term returns. And while the term ESG is relatively new, as all of you know, the practice of corporate responsibility and corporate sustainability is certainly not new. And many companies like Pfizer have had corporate sustainability and responsibility programs for years, if not for decades. And we've been reporting on our progress for years, if not for decades. But ESG is really hinged on the premise that what gets measured gets managed, and that if we have standardized metrics and KPIs, key performance indicators, that we look at across industry, investors will be able to better compare outcomes, companies will be better able to manage their progress and disclosure, and we can drive meaningful action through disclosure on issues related to natural resource conservation, climate change, diversity, equity, and inclusion, board governance, ethical business operations. The umbrella of ESG issues is really, really broad. And that's one of the things that I think can get a little confusing and perhaps watered down. But when I talk about ESG today, I'm going to really be focused on kind of that corporate social responsibility, particularly focused on climate, environment, and human rights. Now, Roger and I did not compare notes when we came to speak today, but I also have a little history that I wanted to talk about, because I really think that to appreciate where we are relative to corporate sustainability now and the rise of its influence on law, I think it's helpful to reflect on where we've been. So I wanted to give a really quick an admittedly totally incomplete history of corporate environmental practice, just to kind of illustrate this arc that we're on. So if you kind of think about, and can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, okay, super, okay, good. You know, kind of going back to like the 70s and 80s, you know, environmental practice was really compliance focused. There were command and control regulations. We were very focused on cleaning up air and water and hazardous materials. And from the corporate perspective, there was this sort of like, I think we probably need some environmental lawyers who are going to help us comply with all of these new environmental laws and regs. And then kind of coming into the 90s, you know, we kind of got compliance under control, and the focus turned to kind of this combination of compliance and risk management and setting standards for corporate performance that maybe served as a minimum threshold. So for Pfizer, for example, in the 90s, we set corporate environmental health and safety standards that set kind of the Pfizer level of operate, you know, our management system for how we were going to operate, and integrated EHS risk management. And also started to get like a little sprinkle of sustainability, which in our case was an energy conservation standard that we published in 1997 as sort of a nod to climate change. There were discussions of triple bottom line. There was the launch of the GRI in the 90s, but it was kind of just beginning. Then in the early 2000s, that focus on compliance and risk management really expanded into the supply chain, at least for us. And we really started heavily focusing on ensuring that what we believed were the appropriate standards of EHS performance were integrated into our supply chain. We also set our first public reduction goal for greenhouse gas emissions and our other sustainability targets. CDP was formed in the early 2000s, and companies started to use that as a framework to build their climate programs. And later, in the still early 2000s, we started seeing companies formalize their corporate sustainability programs. They may have had a corporate responsibility program, but this rise of like environmental sustainability as a programmatic area to drive more ambitious and meaningful progress against sustainability issues above and beyond compliance and above and beyond just risk management really started to take center stage. Around 2011, I would say it kind of marks the rise of the standard setters for sustainability metrics. You saw the formation of SASB, which is the Sustainability Accounting and Standards Board. And you start to see an increase in voluntary disclosure against a lot of these voluntary standards. 2015, fourth IPCC assessment report, the launch of the UN SDGs, the launch of the science-based target initiatives, and we're really seeing some momentum pick up. In 2019, Business Roundtable publishes The Purpose of a Corporation, which notes that we need to consider employees, the environment, and society in addition to shareholders, and that our purpose as corporations is not just the kind of, Milton Friedman, shareholder primacy, but that we're actually trying to work towards a greater good and a more diverse set of stakeholders whom we owe a duty of responsibility to. Then 2020, ESG seems to really take off once the pandemic hits. And it had been moving there anyway, but I think the disruption caused by the pandemic was a catalyst to drive further change. We saw what companies were able to do when faced with a crisis. I work for Pfizer, and we did some pretty miraculous things, both in partnerships with other companies and in really pushing the limits of innovation and scaling up rapidly to address a crisis. So we think as a society, we started to realize what we can do when we're faced with a crisis. Plus, social unrest, all of these drivers kind of just lit the fire under ESG. So since then, voluntary sustainability reporting has really sort of been off the charts. According to a McKinsey study, more than 90% of S&P 500 companies now publish some form of ESG report, and approximately 70% of Russell 1000 companies also publish some sort of a report. Ratings agencies, standard setters are all hard at work measuring corporate sustainability performance, reviewing the standard metrics and KPIs that we need to report against. And as Roger mentioned, sustainability reporting is increasingly, and the programs that uphold the reporting is increasingly being treated with the same rigor as financial reporting and other business processes. So it's really getting integrated into the fiber of companies. But now what we're starting to see is like, you started with regulation, you started with command and control. Let's get our basics under us. Compliance becomes kind of your baseline. And companies start to build on that with voluntary actions, driven by stakeholder expectations, driven by the environmental and societal issues we need to address, and kind of took off maybe a little bit ahead of governments. And now I think governments are starting to step in with policies and laws to kind of level the playing field, drive some accountability in this space. We've seen several types of laws aimed at tackling climate change, environmental impact, and human rights emerging. So leaving aside the Inflation Reduction Act for a moment, up until kind of recently, the most common type of sustainability regulation we were seeing was based on mandatory disclosure. We have some longer standing examples of that, including the UK's Modern Slavery Act, the California Modern Slavery Act, the SEC's conflict minerals rule, right, which are all around ethical behavior in the supply chain. But all they required was really that you just disclose whether you have these issues in your supply chain and how you address them. It didn't mandate, none of them mandate that you take some specific action in terms of understanding or mitigating impact. There's also a similar modern slavery law in Australia and a new one coming into force in Germany. As of last November, in the EU, there were actually 8 mandatory human rights diligence acts that were either proposed or enacted and coming into force. Now, that's just the EU, that's just modern slavery. As of March this year, there were over 91 proposed requirements from 44 countries related to broader ESG disclosure. And those laws are inclusive of climate change disclosure, human rights disclosures, diversity, equity, and inclusion, board governance, and other topics that fall under this big ESG umbrella. But that's 91 proposed requirements from 44 different jurisdictions. And earlier this year in the United States, the SEC issued its proposed disclosure rule on climate change. The final rule is anticipated next month. And of course, that, again, very comprehensive requirements around climate disclosure. Similarly, in the EU, they have a proposed directive on corporate sustainability reporting. And it's similar in some respects to the SEC rule, but it actually goes a little further than just climate and brings in other environmental and social topics. And companies are now very focused on preparing for compliance with these still proposed but anticipated mandatory reporting frameworks. So at least it seems that governments are trying to catch up quickly and regulate in this space that has sort of historically been driven just by voluntary reporting. Now, I would say reporting and disclosure are critical to providing information to investors and other stakeholders. Transparency is a very important part of corporate social responsibility, ensuring we can have a dialogue by sharing information. But I would say disclosure is only an indirect way to drive progress, right? Disclosure relies on companies being concerned about reputational damage if they don't have as much to disclose as they might like. It relies on stakeholders putting pressure on companies to improve performance. And while carefully balanced mandatory disclosure frameworks are important, they don't dictate that companies mitigate adverse impact. Companies need to have their own voluntary programs still to mitigate adverse impact and to know where their priorities are and where they can have the most impact, and to build strong and robust programs in those areas to drive performance. But what we are also seeing is that there's a movement toward more action-oriented legal frameworks and policies aimed at sustainability. There are some examples of modern slavery laws that are going beyond just disclosure and actually requiring that companies undertake diligence of their supply chain partners and then also disclose on that. Another important example that we're monitoring is the EU's proposed corporate sustainability due diligence directive, sort of fondly referred to as the CSDDD or the CSDDD. Here, the EU is seeking to require companies to identify and mitigate or completely eliminate adverse impacts to human rights and the environment along their global supply chains. The directive would require companies to develop transition plans for climate aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway. And all of that is upheld with a framework for enforcement where companies might fall short. So this proposed directive appears to build from and codify a lot of the private governance approaches that companies have already been using to voluntarily identify and manage EHS compliance and risk in their supply chain, and make the mandatory those voluntary actions that we've been taking to develop climate action goals and plans and drive sustainability in the supply chain. The directive also seems to go a step further by really trying to regulate extraterritorially and co-opt the private sector into meeting a lot of the obligations that EU member states have agreed to in various of their multinational treaties on human rights and the environment. So sort of, kind of an interesting landscape to see, like the corporate voluntary actions have kind of gone like this, and now the government regulations are sort of meeting up with the action. Now, as both Roger and John mentioned, right, the US hasn't yet implemented a command and control approach to climate and sustainability action. Instead, the current administration has been, I think, very creatively seeking to leverage market forces. The US has $650 billion in purchasing power, and through several executive orders is looking to demand that products and services that it contracts for are aligned with a 1.5 degree future. And Congress, through the historic work done with NGOs and the private sector, is providing incentives for climate transition through the recently passed Inflation Reduction Act. So far more carrot is being used to accelerate climate action in the United States than stick. But it's sort of an interesting dynamic. So the question that kind of comes to mind for me, and which I'd love to hear panelists' thoughts on and the audience thoughts on, is whether these new legislative developments can drive the needed change, and whether they're the best model. Is command and control the best model? Is mandatory disclosure the best model? Incentives? Do we need a system that places more emphasis on public-private partnerships and leverages market forces? And if governments really step in here, will there still be a place for voluntary corporate action? I think we probably need all of the above. While companies like a GE or a Pfizer are taking bold action, it's not a level playing field. And we need action from all sectors, right? And globally, if we're really going to meaningfully address global environmental and human rights challenges like climate change. Where there need to be government policies, they should be measured and they should take into account and give credit for voluntary action. And I really don't think that, we need to pull kind of all the levers as we move forward. And so even with governments beginning to enter the field, there's still an epic amount of work for us to do, right, to protect the environment and our natural resources. So I think companies will continually need to evaluate their sustainability priorities together with their stakeholders, and focus on the areas where we can make the biggest impact. Corporations like Pfizer, being a multinational company that operates in many jurisdictions around the world, and with a supply chain that is equally vast, we have an opportunity to really help drive sustainable development. Multinational corporations, we operate without borders, so we can set standards of behavior and performance for ourselves and our suppliers that are not dependent on multiple governments acting in concert. And we can often move faster than governments to innovate and drive market behavior. However, if we want to achieve kind of the true promise of ESG, which is preserving long-term corporate value while addressing these intractable issues, the private sector can't do it alone. Government can't do it alone. And so partnerships developed with common goals, mutual trust, are definitely needed, and I think are really beginning to happen. And it may herald a new era of environmental and sustainability practice that all of us will be very fortunate to work in and move forward. So thank you. With that, I'll turn it back to Jordan.
Thank you so much. Sally, can you hear us now? Yes.
I can.
Great, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sally. Greatly appreciate that. We are now going to turn to our third speaker, Dr. Matt.
Okay. Yep. Thanks so much. Try to adjust this so I can speak into it. Well, thanks very much, Jordan, and thanks, Barbara, and to George Washington Law School for hosting this. So I will say a couple things. First, let me just introduce C2S a little bit more, because one thing that we do, I think, is directly relevant to the topic at hand and to the folks in the room. Jordan introduced broadly the organization as one that develops ambitious and practical solutions on climate and energy. We do a lot of that in partnership with companies in the private sector. We have a business council, about 41 Fortune 500 companies that we've worked with, in many cases, for over 20 years. In fact, Roger Martella is one of our board members, and GE has been a longstanding member of that. So a lot of what we do at C2ES is think about the relationship between policy and business action, trying to help and encourage our members of our business council to do more in terms of voluntary action, but also leveraging them to drive well-designed policy. And so this intersection of business action, business corporate action, and policy is sort of the sweet spot for C2ES. I want to make 3 points, and my brief, in a sense, was to talk about the trends in climate change, climate policy, and corporate action. But to some extent, one of the overarching meta themes of my talk has already been illustrated amply by everybody who's talked before me, which is that every topic that we've covered, I think, so far, people have come back to connect into climate change. That would not have been true 10 years ago, 15 years ago, even 5 years ago. You would have heard distinct discussions around natural resources, around ESG, around around management of natural resources, and so on. Everything now ultimately comes back to climate, and I'll talk a little bit, I think, why that is, but it'll also allow me, hopefully, to keep some of my intro short, because I think other people have covered it well. So I want to make 3 points. The first one is that this is really what you've heard so far. There's been a sea change in concern around climate change, around the problem of climate change, the challenge of it, and therefore a sea change in the motivation for climate action. And you've heard a lot about that. I want to add a little bit of flesh to that, a little bit of meat to the bones, but I'll be brief because we've talked a lot about that so far. Then the second point is how that has played out in terms of both corporate commitments and corporate action, as well as policy for mitigation, for reducing emissions. Again, we've actually heard a lot about that as well. I think Julia talked a lot about that, but Roger and Sally did as well. So I want to touch on some of that. That's sort of the bread and butter of what we do at C2S and what I do. But then I want to get to my third point, which is really about something, one of the questions raised in Juliet's talk, which is about resilience and adaptation. And how are companies and to some extent policy thinking about climate risk, about climate resilience, about investing in adaptation to a planet that we know is warming irrevocably, regardless of how much and how fast we cut emissions. We know that there's huge amount of momentum in the system, and we're already seeing the impact. So what are companies doing about that, and what are the policies we see coming down the pike? So that first point about the sea change and concern around climate, maybe I'll be in the spirit of John's talk and give you some statistics, many of these which I thought were really striking. The overall theme is that we are seeing a rise across the board, but especially, as I'll say, among Democrats, but not just among Democrats, of people who say climate change is a top priority. You know, if you go back, you can go back 10 or 15 years, you see Pew and others poll people about, is it important? If you ask people, is climate change important? Many of the people will say, yes, climate and the environment is important. It bounces around 60%, 70%, 55% up and down. But there's a long-standing trend of people saying it's important. What's different is that people are identifying it as a top priority. So nationwide, in 2020, Pew did some research on this. About 2/3 of American adults said the environment is a top priority, more than actually anything else in the economy. Now, of course, this was in 2020. You can obviously, now we've got inflation and so on, but there's some staying power. And over half of adults said that climate was a top priority, and that is on a rise. If you look at the graph, that has climbed very fast over the last couple of years. That is concentrated among Democrats, which has consequences for policy I'll talk about, both good and bad. But 80% of Democrats identify climate as the top priority, or a top priority for, this was again back at the beginning of last year, 80% of Democrats said it was a top priority for President Biden and the Congress. And that was true throughout the primary season. That was true through the general election. We've never seen that before. We've never seen people say climate change is one of the top 3 priorities. And that's a sea change. This is, you see much less among Republicans, but there's an important there's an important demographic who are even say it's even more of a problem than Democrats do, and that's millennials and Gen Z. You have 80% of millennials and Gen Z saying this is a major problem for the world and that this is a top priority. So that fact that millennials are saying this, I think, is making a lot of folks across the political spectrum and in corporates pick up and sort of sit up and take notice. This plays out in a lot of ways. I've talked about voters and polling on political priorities, but Deloitte did a recent poll that suggests that nearly half of Gen Z and more than 40% of millennials are pushing their employers to do more. So we're seeing people not only as voters, as citizens, but also as employees, as consumers, as investors, demanding action from companies. And I think that's really providing some of the sea change we're seeing. A couple more points about this. One is sort of what's the driver? I think the driver is very simple. It's that climate change is impossible to ignore. I started working on this issue full-time 15 years ago. I started, in some ways 20, 25 years ago, but I've been working on climate full-time for 15 years. And when I started, it was very much a niche issue. It was sort of a side thing. Oh, well, it was still, the science was building, but it still felt a little bit like it was, you were a voice in the wilderness. That was certainly true when Jim Hansen and Al Gore were talking about this in 1989. But now it's a fact of life. It used to be something that was going to happen 50 years from now in Bangladesh or in low-lying areas of small island states. 40% of Americans live in counties that experienced an extreme weather disaster last year alone. There were $20 billion plus climate-related disasters that can be attributed to climate change which had a price tag cumulatively of $45 billion just last year. So this is no longer something you can ignore. It's no longer, chicken little. This is, all going to happen in the future. And part of that is driven by science, not only the impacts we're seeing, but the science of attribution, because we can draw clear links between what's happening and the climate impact. And the last thing I want to say here is this is a one-way ratchet. That's unusual, I think, in a lot of issues that affect corporate, that affect the corporate context and corporate, maybe corporate social responsibility issues or corporate commitments more broadly. We know that interest in and concern about climate change is going to increase every year. I can guarantee that because the impacts of climate are going to increase every year. That's scientific, that's just baked in to the dynamics of the system. And so I think we can count on this. It's what we talk a lot about to companies. If you're thinking about a target 5, 10, 15 years ahead, you've got to imagine what the world's going to look like in that time. You're thinking about a 2050 target. Nobody thinks there's no country and there's no company that's not going to have a net zero target by 2050. So anticipate that, get ahead of that, that dynamic. And so that one-way ratchet, I think, is really important. Okay, so how does this play out in terms of policy and actions? And I'll talk first, as I said, about mitigation. We've heard about net zero climate commitments and the like. There was a lot of surveys of this last year in the lead up to that Glasgow climate conference that Juliet mentioned. And what you saw last year, I'm sure it's updated this year, but I haven't seen the more recent statistics. You had 1,200 companies globally, including over a fifth of the world's largest 2,000 largest public companies, had taken on net zero commitments of some form, often by 2050, sometimes sooner. Many of those companies have no idea how they're going to meet those targets, but that creates a driver and a gap for the companies to figure out what to drive action internally, to figure out what they need to do, and also to drive advocacy for policies that can help them close that gap. So you have a huge number of CEOs going out on a limb, telling their shareholders and their investors and their boards that they're going to reach net zero. I'm sure some of those are, well, I don't care. I'm not going to be here in 30 years, but once made, those can't be taken back. And that's driving a lot of this action. On the policy side, I thought Sally did a great job sort of charting the history of policy. I do want to lean into a couple of the sort of significant policy things we just saw, which are going to really shape the landscape in the next few years. You have the bipartisan infrastructure law, or the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act, IIJA, passed last year. Massive amounts of spending, even just for climate, something on the order of 100 billion. And then that was, of course, dwarfed by the Inflation Reduction Act, which had about $360 billion. I mean, that is massive amounts of money. A lot of that is for the power sector. A lot of that is the kind of tax credits that Sally mentioned. So a lot of the money in the Inflation Reduction Act is, as she said, carrots. It's tax credits for zero carbon electricity generation, for nuclear, for wind, all sorts of zero carbon energy generations. For there's money in there for electric vehicle subsidies and for new technologies like hydrogen. But there's also, I went to the White House celebration that was held for the IRA on Tuesday, and was at the happy hour afterwards talking to EPA regional administrators, many of whom I know. And there's $40 billion in that bill for EPA to spend on implementation. I mean, and in that bill, that's like, 10% of the bill, but there's huge amounts of money. I mean, DOE, just from the infrastructure bill, DOE has $60 billion to spend. There's huge amounts of money that's going to be coming into the system, both for mitigation, for things like tax credits, but also for things like investment in resilience that I'll get to in a minute. So I do want to say, before moving on, Sally posed this great question: is voluntary corporate action enough? Is disclosure enough? My answer is no. We need policies, and we're going to need more policies than just the IRA. That's a huge start, but it's just the carrots. And I think we will start to see very soon, you'll start to see this administration roll out more of those regulations. Clean Air Act regulations, especially on tailpipes. We're going to see, I think, quite aggressive moves on cars and trucks. We're going to see regulations on power plants and industries. And we're going to see government procurement regulations and others. So those regulations are going to be coming down. I think we're going to see them quite soon, and that's going to shape the landscape as well. So then the last point I wanted to raise is about resilience and adaptation, because this is something that it's sort of where the conversation is going. There's a lot of conversation about net zero, a lot of conversation about mitigation. I think increasingly there's real recognition that government policy as well as corporate action needs to focus on recognizing and responding to climate risk and then investing in resilience. Sally talked a lot about disclosure, climate risk disclosure. That's a very important part of this. She mentioned the SEC rule. So companies are going to be facing really significant mandatory disclosure rules and much more detail on what that looks like. I think companies, though, are already coming on their own to understand how climate risk makes a difference to their own businesses. We work with a lot of utilities. No utility is ignoring the fact that PG&E has been, really, its very existence is threatened by wildfires and liability in California. Entergy, another one of our business members, saw much of its service territories really inundated in terms of climate-related disasters and really affected its service. You see that across the country. You see real estate developers really thinking about coastal flooding. You see oil and gas companies and chemical companies thinking about their facilities, often on the Gulf Coast. This is a real risk to a lot of businesses, and that means not only taking into account those risks, but investing in resilience. And so that's so we see increasing not only interest inside the companies, but also interest among communities and scrutiny of companies, not just in terms of what they're doing and mitigation, what they're doing to reduce their emissions, but how they're responding, where they're investing and putting money, and what the impacts are on communities. And so we are releasing a report next week. We can talk a little bit about this if there's time in the Q&A, that looks pretty comprehensively at how companies are making these steps, making these investments, look across the board at strategies ranging from investments in their own operations and supply chains to investments in the communities they work in. But a lot happening. And I think this is the cutting edge. The next step is to be really focusing on resilience and adaptation. So we're seeing a sea change in concern around climate and demand for climate action. We've seen that play out in terms of net zero commitments and policies. And I think the next wave of that is really going to focus on natural systems and building adaptation and resilience to the climate impacts we're going to see no matter what. Thanks.
And thank you so much, Nat. We've now gone through the litigation landscape, through some of the corporate action, look at some of the key climate policy action, and Jeff is now going to bring it home, looking at public and private initiatives.
Thank you, Jordan. And it's really a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. And I'd like to thank Barbara for reaching out to Battelle to be a part of this and inviting me to join this esteemed panel and this really great agenda here today. It's really it's an honor to be here. And from we talked a little bit about my background, my introduction, but just by way of Battelle, for those who are not familiar, Battelle is a nonprofit science and technology company. We're the largest actually in the country, actually in the world. And we have a mission of taking biology, chemistry, and advanced materials to trying to solve some of the hardest problems for the betterment of mankind. Kind of a noble mission. We've been around for over 90 years. We do a lot with the Department of Energy, so people may be familiar with us from that, but we also do quite a bit in trying to enable science and the work that we do within our environment and infrastructure business, trying to help empower and enable NSF through programs like research within the NEON program or the Arctic, some of the stuff that gets us most excited. And we're really engaged now and excited about the progress and what we see within the CCS and the hydrogen hubs, and we're really excited to be playing in that space as well. But to talk a little bit more specific about what's going on right now in terms of some of the key influencers and some of the things that we're seeing within public and private sectors and how it's responding to some of the regulatory and legislative issues, particularly as it pertains to PFAS. I'm just going to take a few minutes and just talk through that a bit, because that's really a topic that fits very well with the idea of crossroads, and the fact that PFAS is one of those issues that 4, 5, 6 years ago, members of Congress probably couldn't even spell PFAS, and now you're at a spot where it seems like everywhere you go, you're either hearing something about it, whether it's a press release or a piece of legislation or an event. And that's because really it's everywhere and it impacts every single, community in terms of within congressional districts in states. And so it's something that Congress has been responding to. And one of the benchmarks that I would use, getting back to statistics, is about 5 years ago in the 114th Congress, over those 2 years, there was one bill that was introduced that had to deal with PFAS. In this current session, the 117th Congress, there are 72 pieces of legislation. And in the previous Congress, in the 116th Congress, there was 84. So this is something that really has captured the minds of Congress, and they're moving out. And really there's a reason for that. And much like some of the initiatives that we've talked about here today, that's because of a lot of public pressure and expectations. Quite frankly, Congress was pretty slow to respond, but there was such almost a groundswell at the local grassroots level that they had no choice but to act and to get more aggressive and more involved in that. And in fact, oftentimes states have been really at the forefront in how they were going to drive forward and pushing forward with a regulatory framework to address these unregulated chemicals. So it's been something that's been moving quickly from a congressional perspective and impactfully. And so I'll talk a little bit about what's been going on in Congress. I'll talk a little bit about what the EPA has been doing, and then sort of talk a bit more about how that impacts industry. And so one of the key influencers really has been states where and communities where they've had the biggest problems, and oftentimes that's been driven by having DoD bases in their facilities or in their districts. And you see that action really moving forward in states like New Hampshire, like Michigan, like North Carolina, like Pennsylvania. And these have been some of the key influencers that have been advancing this particular issue. Senator Shaheen from New Hampshire was the very first person to actually put funding into a congressional appropriations bill to address this from a health advisory perspective. And that was just in the FY18 omnibus bill. So it hasn't been long. And now you see hundreds of millions of dollars above the president's budget just within the DoD, within their Defense Environmental Restoration Program, the DERP funds, to address PFAS issues. And that's primarily for site investigations and remedial investigations. So there's a huge influx of dollars now that are being put into this issue from a congressional perspective. And you also see things like a PFAS task force that was created by Congressman Kildee from Michigan and Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania. And there's over 60 members in that. And that just was formed in 2019. So you're seeing a lot of push to try to move forward with policy and with dollars. And we've talked a little bit about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the resources that were included in there. There is $10 billion just to address PFAS in that particular piece of legislation. And again, largely through the EPA and pushing that through to the states, to the state revolving loan funds. But that's a huge influx of money to try to get it into the states, to get into the communities, to try to make an impact, to try to mitigate the issues and the impacts that these unregulated contaminants are going to have in our future here. The other thing that you've seen from a policy perspective is Congress has been moving forward in passing policy, but using the National Defense Authorization Act as the vehicle to do that. And that was an interesting decision. Chairman Inhofe allowed that in 2000. And there's been some significant advancements in PFAS-related policies as a result of that decision. In the 2020 NDAA, you saw some really significant things, such as the phasing out of aqueous film firefighting foam, AFFF. So they have to actually phase that out now of DoD operations. And so they're phasing that out by the end of 2023 and into 24. And so that has a huge impact in terms of trying to, one, get rid of AFFF and one of the greatest sources of the contamination of PFAS, but also trying to help advance innovation and try to figure out how to get the next type of film fighting foam to help meet the needs that DoD does have in that regard. But that was a really impactful thing. The other thing that they did in the FY20 NDAA is they required the EPA to promulgate rules as to how to handle hazardous PFAS waste or how to handle PFAS waste. So that they introduced their interim rules in December of 2020, but that was also a really significant piece of impact on policy through that 2020 NDAA. In 21, they made additional steps, mostly largely around disclosure and trying to advance PFAS-free firefighting foam and notifications to agricultural communities. And then in 2022, one of the big steps that was made was actually a moratorium on incineration for DoD for PFAS waste. And that was largely due to that interim guidance document that the EPA put out at the end of 2020 that really recommended that there were concerns associated with disposal of PFAS waste from incinerators because of air deposition and getting it into the atmosphere, and or putting it in landfills and having landfill leachate get PFAS into the groundwater. So there was one of the recommendations out of that policy or the guidance was, hey, you should stockpile this and wait for technologies to come along that will be able to destroy that PFAS waste. Fortunately for Battelle, that is one of the areas where we've been making a lot of our investments. We have a PFAS annihilator, which is doing quite good in terms of trying to bring a solution to try to help addressing that PFAS waste. But that was a really big decision because where and how you get rid of that waste is becoming more and more difficult as either states are banning incineration or when you talk about EJ communities and where those incinerators are often located, that's obviously a major concern, and fewer landfills are accepting PFAS waste, and agricultural applications becoming more and more restrictive. So there's been a lot of policy that's been moved forward through the NDAA, which is a big deal. The other issue in terms of talking about what the EPA has been doing, they've been focused on this now for some time, a couple of decades now. They really kind of got started looking at it through the Safe Drinking Water Act in about 2009. They looked at it through the Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, the UCMR3 in 2012, which is where they first started kind of monitoring for PFAS within public water systems. So they have a history with that, but I think kind of like the more modern or more recent sort of tipping point that kind of got that ground support and ground grassroots level that I kind of referenced earlier was in 2018 under President Trump. Secretary Pruitt held a national EPA National Leadership Summit, and it was fairly controlled in terms of who could be there, who had access, what media, what kind of questions. And people were grumpy. I mean, people really got frustrated with that. And, the politicians heard that. And so they said to the EPA, what are you going to do? So they started doing regional roundtables in some of those different hotspots where this was such an issue. And they got an earful. And I think then they understood this is a real issue. And then they came out with their EPA PFAS action plan under Administrator Wheeler in February of 19. That was then updated a year later in February of 20. And then most recently, Administrator Regan in October of 21 provided the most recent update to that and really kind of put some more specific dates and bogeys out there for meeting some of these major milestones. So that's really been, I think, a real big trigger. The EPA came out with a lifetime health advisory for the first time in 2016 of 70 parts per trillion. Again, parts per trillion starts to hurt my head a little bit, but then they just updated it back in June, and they were actually now talking about parts per quadrillions. And so like now I can't, like, that's below detectable levels, but I think the point is this stuff is bad, and it's going to become more and more impactful in our everyday lives. And one of the things that you'll see coming up here this fall is the EPA will actually start moving forward with the rulemaking on trying to list PFOA and PFAS, which are the two most common of all the chemicals within the PFAS family, as a hazardous substance. So they just announced their intent to do that about 2 weeks ago. Probably sometime in the month of September, maybe into October, you'll start seeing them go through the Federal Register with the rulemaking process for that. Big deal, because that's going to then trigger, eventually getting into the CERCLA and the Superfund process. And that's going to then have a whole host of another set of liabilities, timeframes, responsible parties. And I think we all kind of remember some of the trials and tribulations associated with the Superfund program. So it'll be interesting to see how they move forward in trying to, make cleanup possible, but also do it in a way that doesn't, really put the boots to, sort of the responsible parties. And one of the challenges right now is a lot of these parties aren't necessarily the producers, right? So a lot of them are secondary receivers, and a lot of them are industry that has product, but not necessarily the manufacturers of it. So So that's certainly going to be an interesting thing to see. There will be a rulemaking process, and then they'll come out with their rule sometime finalized about this time next year, as well as they'll be implementing a maximum contaminant level that will be based off of those lifetime health advisories, and they look to have that in place next year as well. So the regulatory framework that the EPA is pushing is, I don't want to use the word, well, yeah, I will, aggressive, because, they're constrained because they also have to make sure it's defensible, and they have their bottlenecks. Oh yeah, and they are trying to push out all these other programs and such with these influx of federal resources. So finally, that gets us back to industry and how that's impacting industry. And, Department of Defense is obviously one of the major stakeholders in this. They have been acting, I'll reference, very deliberately, not necessarily quickly, but recognizing that they're going to be going through this surplus Superfund process. They have over 700 sites that have identified PFAS contamination in some form or another. While they move these lifetime health advisories and implement an MCL, they're going to have to go back and revisit a lot of those. So that's going to, again, take up a lot of time and resources for them. But the private sector is also one of the major stakeholders in this as well, with a lot of companies putting significant reserves up against the fact that they're going to now have to mitigate this and be potentially listed as a responsible party. You've seen a lot of court cases and settlements that have taken place in various states. I think you'll continue to see that. But the other thing that you're seeing now is a quick and an urgency to act, to try to remove or dispose of their PFAS waste prior to it being listed as a hazardous substance. So we're seeing a lot of private entities that want to use, well, in our case, our annihilator system to try to destroy that waste. A lot of municipal fire departments that have this AFFF stockpiled, they're trying to get rid of that with some urgency, because then that's going to bring a whole host of additional burdens, responsibilities, times, and requirements once it becomes listed as hazardous, which is most likely going to be in the next 18 to 24 months or so. So in closing, I'll just say that again, this is an issue that is very much in crossroads. There are a lot of different influencers that have been making and advancing this in Congress, within the federal agencies, and certainly has the attention of the private sector as they look to try to make sure that they can continue to operate the commerce, but in a way that doesn't provide challenges from a financial perspective with limited budgets. So I look forward to additional Q&A, and again, thank you for the opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks to all of you. We've now gone through the quartet. So we've gone through litigation, we've gone through the corporate initiatives, we've gone through climate policy, and we've gone through other natural resources policy. And Jeff wins the award for keeping best within time. And you have the lucrative award of a lifetime of gratitude.
14:49. We had 15
11
minutes,
seconds
so.
to go. So thank you all. On the statistics track, we are now in the 1% zone between you and lunch. So I do want to keep on time. So I will go ahead and go straight to opening it up to questions. If anyone has any questions for any of our speakers, and then I do have a closing question from me. Ooh. Fantastic. Well, then I get the questions. I know. Oh, fantastic. Well, then I will actually ask the question. And so,
Yes, why don't you pose questions that we were going to give to the panel if you wanted the audience?
and we'll call on all of you instead. All right. Well, so this is for our panel. This is for all of you as well, it turns out. So the question is, how can stakeholders focus on solutions for natural resource conservation and restoration so as to mitigate and or modify and or influence these influences we've been talking about today? So what are the major vectors? And I'll move through whether that's policy development, joint initiative, corporate strategies. How can individual stakeholders act right now? John, you're nodding. That means you get called on.
I thought in some ways, Julie Upland's presentation today gave you, all of us, a window to the future. So much of our experience in environmental law has been driven by things that happened pretty much in the 70s and 80s where we have this explosion of environmental law. So we're kind of used to having Congress takes an act and then government agencies implement it and the rest of us have a benefit from that. And I thought Juliet's presentation and to some degree Rogers as well changed that. It changed it to say, frankly, we're not going to see some major piece of legislation. I get it that the IRA, which is more carrots and sticks, is a great step forward. But if we're looking for some national legislation that's going to give us caps on climate, I don't think we're going to see that. But what they were giving us there, and you gave us some as well, is the places for people, for organizations, for others who drive instead of coming down, which is where we've gotten environmental law up until this date. It's coming up. It's coming up from individuals, from bondholders, from shareholders. I love the comment by one of you all, one of the panelists, that millennials are looking to have an impact on their employer that way, as that being a future. So the future is all of us individually playing a role and not waiting for something on high happening, because that's very unlikely.
Sure. So let me follow up on that and give a little bit more specificity to some of the themes that I mentioned just at the tail end, because I think this question really comes into what can companies do. I would think of it through a climate lens to invest in resilience, including through investing in natural resources and nature-based climate solutions and resilience. And I think we're increasingly seeing, as I said, the business community making those investments directly. So what can businesses do? Obviously, there's engagement with policy, and there's and there's their own operations and supply chains. All of those things are important. But I think we're seeing an increasing trend of really interesting examples of direct investment into the communities, or else co-investment with public-private partnerships. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Starting relatively small, Shell and Entergy are two different examples. Each companies that have invested about $2 million into their own local community resilience through grant initiatives. So Entergy did that after the hurricane, and did that to help its own communities build resilience. And Shell has done something similar in Houston. PG&E and Meta combined to do a really interesting, or to secure a really interesting grant. This is a kind of public-private example. PG&E put in $10 million. This is out in the Bay Area in Menlo Park for resilience and wetlands restoration. Meta put in $8 million, and that combined allowed them to unlock a $50 million federal grant. So that's a great example of corporates coming in and providing some of the money that can unlock a much bigger federal grant aimed around resilience and adaptation. And then Salesforce, obviously they've got deep pockets more than most, but they've put in place a $100 million grant program and fund for ecosystem restoration and climate justice. So again, that intersection of ecosystem restoration, climate resilience, and equity and justice, I think, is really well illustrated there. So those are some examples of what I think different companies around the country are doing directly in this space.
Thank you, Nat. The fact that Barbara is standing behind me, do we have time for one more? Is there a closing comment? Oh, fantastic. Interesting. Okay. We would.
So let me then, I just want to add then when to Jeff and when to Sally and when to Roger. And this is only because I also teach here at George Washington. There is a concept that we've been, an academic concept that embraces a lot of things that I think, in particular, Sally and Roger were talking about, and that's the concept of private governance. So I just want to add that to your lexicon. Private governance is the role of corporations who are doing things in governance that ultimately, before somewhere, people like me at Department of Justice were doing. So if you are enforcing what's happening in your supply chain, if you're demanding from others that they are disclosing, these are things that we are now, at least in the academic circles, calling private governance. So I just want to add that to your wording and urge you to read about that as it comes out. There's people writing about this, and it puts together some of the concepts we've been talking about today.
That brings us full circle to between this symposium in 2020 and the 2022, because we had actually the professors here. That is exactly what we talked about in 2020. Private government. So the theme of this is working together, but so much is coming through the private sector now, and that has changed very, very much, where people are not just relying upon government. And so it's very interesting, all the observations today. I hate to cut this panel short. Each of you had wonderful contributions, and we're very appreciative to Jordan for doing a good job moderating this. We'll continue the conversation over lunch. We're breaking now. Lunch is being served in the same place that breakfast was served. And we'll find a spot somewhere to perch. We will come back in here for a 1 o'clock sharp start to our lunch session speakers. We'll then run for, I guess, 1 hour, and then we'll go into our first expert panel. So 45 minutes, enjoy yourself, and maybe even duck out for a breath of fresh air. And we'll see you back in this room no later than 1 o'clock. If you are going into a full hold with the Zoom, there's a separate Zoom login for the afternoon session, so we're closing this session in a few minutes.